and welcome to today's lecture. The topic for today's lecture is concept and scope of stress. The main objectives of today's topic are to learn the meaning and definitions of stress, what is fight or flight response, types of stress, meaning of the stressors, types of stressors, symptoms of stress, effects of stress, nature of stress, and models of stress. The word stress has been derived from the Latin word stringer, which means to be drawn tight, and was popularly used in the 17th century to mean hardship, strait, adversity, or affliction. The term stress was first used in 17th century to describe sorrow, suppression, discomfort, and adversity. The term stress had not gained attention in the field of human behavior until Seeley in 1936 suggested using it to describe what will happen when an organism is exposed to an unpleasant stimulus. Hans Selye defined stress as the non-specific response of the body to any demand. Selye found in numerous experiments that laboratory animals subjected to acute but different noxious physical and emotional stimuli all exhibited the same pathological changes of stomach, ulcerations, shrinkage of lymphoid tissues, and enlargement of the adrenals. He later demonstrated that persistent stress could cause these animals to develop various diseases similar to those seen in humans, such as heart attacks, stroke, kidney disease, and rheumatoid arthritis. In general, stress may be defined as a state of psychological and physiological imbalance resulting from disparity between situational demand and the individual's ability and motivation to meet the demands of the situation. Different people have defined stress in their own way, and let's discuss some of the definitions. Spielberger defines stress as an integral part of the natural fabric of life, and coping with stress is an everyday requirement for normal human growth and development. Lazarus and Folkman define stress as a pattern of negative physiological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being which they may be unable to deal with. Skinner defines stress as a reaction of a particular individual to a stimulus event. Humphrey defines stress as any factor acting internally or externally that makes it difficult to adapt and that induces increased effort on the part of the person to maintain a state of equilibrium both internally and with the external environment. Steinberg and Ritzman say that stress can be defined as an underload or overload of matter, energy, or information input to or output from a living system. Eliot defines stress as body's response to any real or imagined event perceived as requiring some adaptive response and or producing strain. Seward defines stress as the experience of a perceived threat, real or imagined, to one's mental, physical, or spiritual well-being resulting from a series of physiological responses and adaptations. Now we shall talk a bit about the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response, also known as the acute stress response, refers to a psychological reaction that occurs in the presence of something that is terrifying either mentally or physically. The fight or flight response was first described in the 1920s by American physiologist Walter Cannon as a theory that animals react to threats with a general discharge of the sympathetic nervous system. Popularized in his book The Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage in 1929. He also expanded on Claude Bernard's concept of homeostasis. He popularized his theories in his book The Wisdom of the Body, first published in 1932. Cannon realized that a chain of rapidly occurring reactions inside the body help mobilize the body's resources to deal with threatening circumstances. The sympathetic nervous system responds immediately to any perceived threat and is responsible for arousal. The sympathetic nervous system increases respiration and blood flow to muscles that speed up our escape from danger, activating the fight or flight response. During fight or flight, the body tenses, speeds up, and becomes very alert to deal with any potential threat. In response to acute stress, the body's sympathetic nervous system is activated due to sudden release of hormones. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal glands that triggers the release of catecholamines, which include adrenaline and non-adrenaline. This in turn results in an increase in heart rate, blood pressure and breathing rate. After the threat is gone, it takes between 20 to 60 minutes for the body to return to its pre-arousal levels. Essentially, the response prepares the body to either fight or threat or flee it. The response can be triggered due to both real and imaginary threats. Now, let us discuss the types of stress. First one is acute stress. Acute stress is the most common among the general population. This form of stress is usually short-term and specific. The cause of acute stress is often immediately apparent. Acute stress is triggered by an imminent emotional or physical threat. This is the type of stress that comes on quickly and often unexpectedly and does not last too long, but requires a response and it shakes you up a bit. Chronic stress. Chronic stress, in contrast with acute stress, is persistent over a long period of time. This long-term stress usually comes from a different life situations like an unhealthy relationship, living in long-term poverty, or any other miserable situation. People who suffer from chronic stress are most at risk for developing medical conditions related to the long-term problem and can be at higher risk of attempting suicide. This type of stress may leave an individual feeling drained and can lead to burnout if it's not effectively managed. Now, episodic acute stress. While a certain level of acute stress is normal, for some people, acute stress becomes a regular facet of life. If an individual constantly feels like that he or she is only one step away from absolute disaster, it can lead to episodic acute stress. Even though episodic acute stress is most often created by taking on too many projects at one time and doing things that put you in the repeated stressful situations. The symptoms can be just as alarming, and this ongoing stressful lifestyle can lead to physical and psychological problems. Emotional stress. The pain of emotional stress can hit harder than other types of stress. For example, the stress that comes from a conflicted relationship tends to bring a greater physical reaction and a stronger sense of distress than the stress that comes from being busy at work. Therefore, it is important to be able to manage emotional stress in effective ways. Strategies that help you to process, diffuse and build resilience towards emotional stress can all work well, and different approaches can work in different situations. Now coming to types of stress. According to Friedman, stress factors broadly fall into 4 types of categories: physical stress, psychological stress, psychosocial stress, and psychospiritual stress. Coming to physical stress. Physical stress includes trauma, intense physical labor or overexertion, environmental pollution, illness, fatigue, inadequate oxygen supply, hypoglycemia, that is low blood sugar, hormonal or biochemical imbalances, dietary stress, dehydration, substance abuse, dental challenges, and musculoskeletal misalignments or imbalances. Second one is psychological stress. It includes emotional stress, cognitive stress, emotion overload, accelerated sense of time, worry, guilt, shame, jealousy, resistance, attachments, self-criticism, self-loathing, unworkable, perfectionism, anxiety, panic attacks, not feeling like yourself, not feeling like things are real, and a sense of being out of control, not being in control, and perceptual stress, beliefs, roles, stories, attitudes, and worldview. Psychosocial stress. It includes relationships or marriage difficulties like partner, siblings, children, family, employer, co-workers, or employer. Lack of social support, lack of resources for advocate survival, loss of employment, investments, savings, loss of loved ones, bankruptcy, home foreclosure, and isolation. Psychospiritual stress. It includes a crisis of values, meaning, and purpose, joyless, striving, and a misalignment with one's core spiritual beliefs. Overall, improperly or ineffectively managed stress usually takes a toll on the body. Elbricht's 4 types of stress. Dr. Carl Elbricht is a pioneer in the development of stress reduction training for business people. He defined 4 common types of stress in the 1979 book Stress and the Manager. The 4 common types of stresses are: first one is time stress. An individual experiences time stress when he worries about time or the lack thereof. An individual often worries about the number of things that he has to do, and he fears that he will fail to achieve something important. He might feel trapped, unhappy, or even hopeless. Common examples of time stress include worrying about deadlines or rushing to avoid being late for a meeting. Now, anticipatory stress. Anticipatory stress describes stress that an individual experiences concern for the future. Sometimes, this stress can be focused on a specific event. However, anticipatory stress can also be vague and undefined, such as an overall sense of dread about the future or a worry that something will go wrong. Situational stress. An individual experiences situational stress when he is in a scary situation that he has no control over. This could be an emergency. In other words, it's a situation that involves conflict or loss of status or acceptance in the eyes of other people. Encounter stress. Encounter stress revolves around people. An individual experiences encounter stress when he worries about interacting with certain person or group of people. Encounter stress can also occur if your role involves a lot of personal interactions. For instance, physicians and social workers have high rates of encounter stress because the people they work with routinely don't feel well or are deeply upset. Coming to the portion of stressors. A stressor is any adverse experience, physiological, psychological, or social, that causes a stress response. The stressor must be perceived as stressful by an individual to activate the stress response. There are individual variations as to what is perceived as stressful, and research shows that humans can imagine stressors and experience the same physiological arousal as from external environment stressors. A stressor is defined as situation, circumstance, or any stimulus that is viewed as a threat. Stressors are described as acute, that is sudden, or chronic, that is persisting over a longer period of time. Stressors may or may not cause stress in an individual depending on the person's capacity to cope with the stressors. According to Seward in 2012, a large amount of research has been done to determine the nature of stressors, and they are divided into 3 groups: bioecological, social, and psycho-interpersonal. Bioecological stressors. Bioecological influences can trigger people's stress response in various ways, some outside of their awareness. External influences such as sunlight, gravitational pull, solar flares, and electromagnetic fields affect people's biological rhythms. The 3 domains affected by these factors are circadian rhythms, fluctuations in physiological functions over the course of 24-hour period; ultradian rhythms, fluctuations that occur over less than a 24-hour period; and infradian rhythms, changes that occur in periods longer than 24 hours. Now, psycho-intrapersonal. Psycho-intrapersonal influences are the perceptions of stimuli that are created through a person's own mental processes, perceptions, and interpretations. Stressors such as thoughts, values, beliefs, attitudes, opinions, and perceptions that people use to defend their identity or ego fit in this category. Social stressors. Social influences that can cause stress involve situations in which people struggle to cope with their given environment, such as crowded urban areas, long lines at the grocery store, and traffic jams, or wherever their personal space is invaded. Seward in 2012 explained that cause of this particular social influence may be intuitive in nature, considering that the desire for personal space appears to be universal in the animal kingdom, including humans. Additionally, financial insecurity, relocating, technological advances, violation of human rights, and low socioeconomic status fall into this group as 2 major life changes. Let us talk about some common types of stressors now. The 5 kinds of stressors are acute time-limited stressors. Acute time-limited stressors are ones given in a controlled environment such as a lab. For example, presenting an individual with something that he does not feel comfortable doing. The stressor sparks intense stress, but only for the time it takes to elicit a response. Brief naturalistic stressors. Brief naturalistic stressors are the ones that occur naturally in environment. The stress one experiences usually only lasts for the time an individual is in the stressful situation. Stressful event sequences. Stressful event sequences happen when there is a traumatic event that causes additional stressors. For example, if one is victim of natural disaster and then he has to deal with loss of loved ones, belongings and pulling your life back together. Chronic stressors. Chronic stressors are situations that happen to force an individual to change his identity or social roles. For example, if one becomes disabled, he will need to adjust his life to accommodate his disabilities. Distant stressors. Distant stressors are stress that happened a long time ago but continue to affect an individual negatively because of emotional and cognitive issues. Some examples of distant stressors include child abuse, having been a prisoner of a war, loss of a loved one, etc. Types of stressors as per Giordano, Duzic and Everly in 2009. They categorize stressors into two categories, that is, psychosocial stressors and biogenic stressors. So, what are psychosocial stressors? Psychosocial stressors are either real or imagined environmental events that set the stage for the elicitation of the stress response. They cannot directly cause a stress response but must work through cognitive appraisal mechanics. Biogenic stressors. Biogenic stressors, however, actually cause the elicitation of the stress response. Such stimuli bypass the higher cognitive appraisal mechanisms and work directly on the affective and neurological triggering nuclei. Thus, by virtue of their biochemical properties, they directly initiate the stress response without the usual requisite cognitive or affective processing. Coming to symptoms of stress. Common symptoms of stress on body involves headache, muscle tension or pain, chest pain, fatigue, upset stomach, sleep problems, feeling of numbness, loss of appetite, back pains, weakens immune system. Now, common symptoms of stress on mood: anxiety, restlessness, lack of motivation or focus, feeling overwhelmed, irritability or anger, sadness or depression, disbelief and shock, tension and irritability, nightmares and recurring thoughts about the event. Now, common symptoms of stress on behavior: overeating or undereating, trouble concentrating, feeling powerlessness, angry outbursts, drug or alcohol abuse, tobacco use, social withdrawal, exercising less often, loss of interest in normal activities. Common cognitive symptoms of stress include mental slowness, confusion, general negative attitudes or thoughts, constant worry, mind races at times, difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, difficulty thinking in a logical sequence. Effects of stress. Stress adversely affects an individual both physically as well as psychologically. Stress triggers mental and emotional problems such as insomnia, headaches, personality change, irritability, anxiety and depression. Mouth ulcers and excessive dryness are often related with stress. High stress levels may cause excessive hair loss and some forms of baldness. Spasmodic pains in the neck and shoulders, musculoskeletal aches, lower back pain and various minor muscular twitches are more noticeable under stress. Stress could lead to cardiovascular disease including heart disease, high blood pressure, abnormal heart rhythms, heart attacks, stroke and hypertension. High levels of mental or emotional stress adversely affect individuals with asthmatic conditions. Stress can cause or aggravate disease of the digestive tract including gastritis, stomach and duodenal ulcers, ulcerative colitis and irritable colon. Some individuals react to stress with outbreaks of skin problems such as eczema. Stress makes it difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep, which could lead to insomnia. Prolonged stress weakens the immune system, which makes individual more vulnerable to diseases and infections or altering the course of an illness if individual already has one. Now, we shall discuss the nature of stress. Stress is a state of psychological and physical tension produced when there is a mismatch between the perceived demands of a situation and the individual's perceived ability to cope. The consequent state of tension can be adaptive or maladaptive. The nature of stress can be summed up Like, stress is associated with both causes as well as effects. Stress is not a factor that resides in an individual or the environment. Instead, it is embedded in an ongoing process. Stress is dynamic, mental, cognitive state. It is a disruption in homeostasis or an imbalance that gives rise to requirement for resolution of that imbalance or restoration of homeostasis. Stress is an individual's response to a disturbing factor in the environment and consequences of such reaction. Stress is a reaction to change. It can be either positive or negative, and it affects both the body and the mind. Stress can be positive or negative. Stress is positive when it offers opportunity to gain something. Stress is negative when it causes emotional, physical, and social problems. Stress is related to both external and internal factors. External factors include all the situation, challenges, difficulties, and expectations you are confronted with on a daily basis. Internal factors determine your body's ability to respond to and deal with external stress-inducing factors. Stress is neither a stimulus nor a response, but an ongoing transactional process between individual and his environment. Now, we will talk about the models of stress. There are three main theoretical approaches for stress, and each one interprets stress differently, namely as a stimulus, as a response, and as a transaction. Stimulus-based models. In these models, the stress is interpreted as a stimulus, a life event, or a group circumstances which may awaken physical or psychological reactions, which may increase the vulnerability of the individual to disease. According to Holmes, there are 43 life events or lifestyle changes which can cause stress. According to this theory, both positive and negative life events are considered stressful. Cox in 1981 termed these stimulus-based models as engineering model of stress. Stimulus-based model assume that after a certain point, the tolerance to stress comes to an end, which can result in physical and mental damage to a person. He highlighted that the stimulus-based models of stress postulate that stress reaction or strain occur when external stresses have their action on individuals. Further, he explains that a certain degree of stress is tolerated by every individual because of the development of resistance through learning from such situations and from genetic makeup of the individual for stress. Response-based models. In these theoretical models, stress is interpreted as a response. The definition of stress as a response was developed and described by Sallier, who defined stress as a non-specific response of the body to any kind of demands applied on it. Sallier's model is called general adaptation syndrome. Hans Sallier, an Austro-Hungarian endocrinologist, was referred to as the Einstein of medicine for his pioneering contribution to science through his famous theory of influence of stress on people's ability to cope with pressures of injury and disease called the general adaptation syndrome. Sallier first introduced the concept of stress in 1939. It is a concept borrowed from the natural sciences. GAS consists of three stages, which include the alarm reaction stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage, which are explained as alarm reaction stage. Upon perceiving a stressor, the body reacts with a fight or flight response and the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated as the body's resources are mobilized to meet the threat or danger. This stage consists of an increased activity in the sympathetic adrenal medullary system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. Sallier argued that the alarm reaction develops 6 to 48 hours. Now, resistance stage. The body resists and compensates as the parasympathetic nervous system attempts to return many physiological functions to normal levels while body focuses resources against the stressor and remains on alert. Resistance involves an activity in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. This is when the body is adapting or fitting in with the demands of the environment. However, the body returns to a near normal state if the stress is not too great. Exhaustion stage. The physiological systems used in the previous two stages become less effective when stress becomes too prolonged. The early stages of the autonomic nervous system symptoms of arousal reappear. If the stressor or stressors continue beyond the body's capacity, the resources become exhausted and the body is susceptible to disease and the death. In some severe cases, the damaged adrenal cortex leads to failure of the parasympathetic system. Coming to transaction-based models. All theoretical models that interpret stress as transactions are based on the theory of Lazarus, who focused on the fact that there are differences among people in interpretation of stress as a stimulus or as a response. According to Richard Lazarus, stress is a two-way process. It involves the production of stressors by the environment and the response of an individual subjected to these stressors. His conception regarding stress led to the theory of cognitive appraisal. The transactional model of stress and coping proposes that stress is experienced as an appraisal of the situation an individual finds himself in. Specifically, the transactional model suggested that an individual go through two stages of appraisal before feeling and responding to stress, that is, primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. So, what is primary appraisal? Primary appraisal determines whether what is happening could be harmful, threatening, challenging, beneficial, or of no importance to the individual. Here, the individual evaluates a situation to decide if it is relevant to him. In particular, one evaluates whether it will bring about the possibility of gain or harm. If it doesn't, one don't worry about it. Decide it is irrelevant, but if it is relevant, he decides if it is positive or dangerous. Secondary appraisal. If an individual feels that situation is dangerous, he then moves into making a secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisal evaluates the physical, psychological, social and material resources available to cope with the event. If all other factors are equal, the person who has a strong belief that he or she can handle an event is less likely to interpret it as a threat. This brings us to the end of the topic. Thanks for watching.